The room is still as the cameras click to life in Beijing's foreign ministry. Behind the lectern stands Lin Jian, China's foreign ministry spokesman. His tone is calm, deliberate, but the message unmistakably pointed. China carries out normal, legitimate economic, trade and energy cooperation with countries around the world, including Russia, he says. The actions of the United States, he continues, are a typical example of unilateral bullying and economic coercion. His words are sharp, but his expression remains composed. The statement lands as a direct rebuttal to Washington's growing pressure campaign. In recent weeks, President Donald Trump's administration has intensified its push to isolate Russia economically, urging nations to halt imports of Russian oil and gas. The White House insists the sanctions are designed to cut funding for Moscow's war effort in Ukraine. Yet in Beijing, the narrative is very different. Officials argue that energy trade is not only legitimate but essential to global stability, and they are framing Washington's demands as an attempt to weaponize economic policy. The tension has been building for months. Since early 2025, the United States has imposed several rounds of secondary sanctions, targeting companies and banks that facilitate Russian energy exports. Chinese refiners, particularly those operating in the northeastern provinces and coastal industrial hubs, have quietly increased their intake of discounted Russian crude. According to energy tracking data, shipments through the Eastern Siberia Pacific Ocean pipeline have remained steady, while imports by sea via the port of Qingdao have even risen. For Beijing, the rationale is straightforward: ensuring energy security in an era of volatility. But in Washington, that rationale rings hollow. The Trump administration views continued purchases of Russian oil as undermining global unity against Moscow. During a press conference last week, President Trump warned that nations cannot say they stand for peace while financing aggression. His advisers have hinted at the possibility of sanctioning Chinese shipping firms or restricting insurance access for vessels carrying Russian crude. Such measures, if enacted, could roil global energy markets and push prices higher, a risk that both producers and consumers would feel. Inside China, however, the framing is nationalist and defiant. State media outlets highlight Beijing's role as a stabilizing force in global energy trade. Commentators emphasize that China has never accepted foreign interference in its commercial decisions. On social media, hashtags denouncing US bullying have trended on major platforms, tapping into a long-standing public sentiment that Washington uses sanctions to maintain dominance. Analysts in Beijing argue that by buying Russian oil, China is not only securing supply, but also signaling that it won't bow to Western pressure. The diplomatic language may sound measured, but behind it lies a complex calculus. China's economy, still recovering from the shocks of global inflation and uneven post-pandemic demand, relies heavily on affordable energy. Russian crude, sold at a discount due to Western sanctions, offers Beijing a practical advantage. Moreover, the trade reinforces a growing strategic alignment between China and Russia, a partnership built on shared opposition to what they call unilateralism. As Lin Jian's statement makes clear, Beijing sees itself as defending the principles of open trade, even as it stands accused of enabling Moscow's war machine. For Washington, this presents a dilemma. Sanctioning Chinese firms could escalate into a broader trade confrontation, one that extends far beyond oil. Already, tensions are simmering over technology, rare earth exports, and tariffs on Chinese goods. The prospect of adding energy sanctions to that mix could trigger a cascade of retaliatory steps. Some American officials privately acknowledge that punishing China might fracture the coalition they've tried to build against Russia, especially among developing nations that also continue to buy discounted Russian fuel. As reporters pressed Lin Jian for specifics, he repeated Beijing's familiar refrain that its cooperation with Russia is based on equality and mutual benefit. He added that the United States should stop abusing unilateral sanctions and respect the rights of other countries to conduct normal trade. His statement echoed similar remarks made earlier this year by senior Chinese diplomat Wang Yi, who described US policy as economic coercion dressed in moral clothing. To Beijing, the sanctions narrative is not about law or justice, it's about power. Energy experts say the implications reach far beyond geopolitics. China now accounts for nearly 1/3 of global oil demand. Any disruption to its imports could ripple through markets worldwide. By maintaining steady purchases from Russia, China helps keep global supply balanced, but at the cost of deepening political divisions with the West. European officials have expressed quiet frustration, noting that while the EU bears the economic pain of embargoes, Beijing continues to benefit from cheap Russian energy. It's a paradox, one Brussels diplomat told reporters, that sanctions meant to punish Moscow are strengthening Beijing's hand. Within Russia, the picture is equally complicated. The Kremlin has found in China a lifeline that offsets some of the financial pain inflicted by Western restrictions. Payments in yuan have surged, bypassing the dollar system and dulling the impact of US sanctions. Moscow's energy revenue, though reduced, remains substantial enough to sustain its military spending. And that dynamic, Washington fears, could prolong the war in Ukraine. Yet Beijing insists its stance is neutral. Chinese officials often remind the world that their country has not supplied weapons to either side in the conflict and continues to call for dialogue. What they reject, they say, is being forced to choose sides. It's a line that resonates with many nations in the global south, where skepticism of US dominance runs deep. From Africa to Southeast Asia, diplomats privately echo Beijing's critique that Western sanctions often prioritize political agendas over humanitarian needs. In the days following Lin Jian's remarks, Chinese state broadcasters aired lengthy segments defending the government's position. They showed maps of global energy flows, charts of oil prices, and interviews with economists warning that US measures could backfire. Editorials argued that if Washington punishes countries for buying Russian oil today, it might one day punish them for buying Iranian gas, Venezuelan crude, or even Chinese technology tomorrow. The message was clear. Today it's Russia, tomorrow it could be anyone. Meanwhile, in Washington, Trump's allies have framed the issue as a test of strength. If Beijing won't cooperate, then we'll make it too costly not to, said one senior official. US media outlets sympathetic to the administration have amplified the argument that China's oil purchases amount to indirect funding of Russian aggression. Some commentators on conservative networks have gone further, accusing Beijing of profiting from blood oil. The rhetoric plays well to Trump's base, reinforcing his image as a leader who takes on both China and Russia simultaneously. But foreign policy experts warn that this zero-sum framing could spiral. You can't sanction half the world and expect the other half to stand still, said an analyst from the Peterson Institute in a recent interview. They note that the more Washington uses sanctions as a tool of pressure, the more other nations invest in alternatives, from local currency trade settlements to regional payment systems that bypass the dollar. In that sense, the US push to isolate Russia may inadvertently accelerate the de-dollarization trend that Beijing and Moscow have long championed. Back in Beijing, the Foreign Ministry's briefing room has returned to its routine rhythm. Reporters file their stories, analysts pass Lin Jian's phrasing, and state media packages the footage for evening broadcasts. Yet behind the polished podium diplomacy, a larger contest is unfolding, one over who defines the rules of global trade. For China, defending its right to buy oil is about more than barrels and pipelines. It's about sovereignty, the ability to chart its own course without yielding to external dictates. For Washington, it's about moral leadership and the belief that nations must act collectively to punish aggression. Both narratives are compelling and mutually exclusive. Each side sees the other as hypocritical. China accuses the US of double standards, pointing to America's own history of selective sanctions. The US accuses China of exploiting crises for profit. Between them lies a world struggling to keep energy markets stable amid political storms. As winter approaches, the stakes are rising. Europe braces for higher heating costs, while Asian refiners weigh how to navigate shifting sanction regimes. The Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries watches carefully, wary of turbulence that could unbalance supply and demand. Traders whisper about potential shipping restrictions that could send freight rates soaring. Every word from Beijing or Washington now carries the power to move markets. Lin Jian's comments may have lasted less than half a minute, but their resonance will linger far longer. His choice of words, unilateral bullying, economic coercion, threat to global supply chains, encapsulates China's evolving diplomatic posture, firm, defiant, and increasingly willing to challenge US dominance in public forums. For a world audience, it's another sign that the once quiet rivalry between the two powers has become an open ideological contest. For journalists covering this story, the scene in Beijing captures the essence of today's geopolitics: diplomacy through defiance. A carefully worded statement delivered with composure, yet designed to send a tremor through global capitals. It is part of a broader trend, nations asserting autonomy, challenging sanctions, and reshaping alliances in response to shifting power balances. By the time Lin Jian leaves the podium, the day's headlines are already forming. China defends Russian oil imports, slams US bullying. It's a story that will ripple across continents, from the White House briefing room to trading floors in Singapore, from Moscow's energy ministry to Brussels' policy circles. Each will read it differently, but all will recognize its significance. The world's second largest economy is drawing a line, once again, between what it calls fairness and what it sees as coercion. And as the camera lights fade and the reporters pack up, Beijing sends a familiar message to the world that it will make its own choices and live by them, no matter the pressure.